Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I want to start off by welcoming everyone to our Women at Ardent webinar for January 2021, focused on leading with intention and purpose for this year. My name is Stacey Malone. I work at the corporate office and as the Vice President of Internal Audit, and want to start with a couple of housekeeping items. Please remember that all the phones will be muted throughout the presentation, but we ask you to please submit any questions that you have using the chat functionality. Also, please note that for the best viewing experience, we recommend that you use the side-by-side function in the top right-hand corner of WebEx. This will allow you to see both the presentation and the speakers throughout our presentation. We will start by introducing you all with our speakers for the day. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from Marty Bonick, our President and CEO, as well as Jessica Stidham, who's a Manager of Talent and Development here at the corporate office. The start of the new year, as we all know, is a time where we try to focus on our goals, both those that are personal and professional, and make our mental, physical, and emotional well-being a priority. With that in mind, this is going to be a great presentation to help us think about those items, and we look forward to hearing both Marty and Jesse's insights on how leaders can achieve those goals and priorities for 2021. But before we get to Marty and Jesse, we want to start with a reminder of the purpose of Women at Ardent, the reason that we're all here today. So, as a reminder, the purpose is to elevate women within our organization by providing opportunities and resources and increasing visibility to develop leadership skills that further enhance the network of Women at Ardent. And so at every webinar to start off with, we also want to make sure that we connect back to the purpose, not just of Women at Ardent, but the purpose of Ardent as a whole. This month is a little bit different than normal. Rather than highlighting just one individual, we're actually taking the time to recognize all of our employees who have received the COVID-19 vaccine. And so on your screens, you'll see a couple of photos of Ardent employees across all 6 states or our hospitals that have already received the vaccine. And so to those that have been vaccinated, we just want to say thank you for showing leadership to your teams and supporting our company and country's vaccination efforts. And with that, we will move right into our presentation.
Thank you so much, Stacey. So today we are going to get started with an overview of our 2021 strategic priorities with Marty. Then we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into some successful leadership strategies that will help you execute on those strategies and lead with intention and purpose in the upcoming year. Finally, we'll wrap it all up with some suggestions on how you can put all of this into action. And we should have some time at the end for questions, so feel free throughout the session to put your questions in the chat. Okay, so Marty, why don't you tell us a little bit about the strategic priorities for 2021?
Great, thank you. Thank you, Stacey, for that introduction, and Jesse, it's great to be co-presenting with you today. It's great to see people on screen, too. Thank you for those that have turned on the camera. We're still living in this world, and it's nice to at least be able to see and interact, at least facially, with people if we can't be doing this live in person. So thank you all for being here today. As Jesse said, hopefully some of you were able to attend the leadership briefing that we had just a couple of weeks ago. And I'm not going to repeat that, but for those that might not have had the opportunity, I wanted to share the what in terms of the goals that we've outlined for 2021. And as we think about 2021, you know, my goal has always been to try to simplify and clarify expectations so that we can have a great shot at achieving those. And as we look at our pillars, which we're all familiar with, the challenge I set out to our team is what are really those outcomes that we're most focused on in terms of achieving from an outcomes perspective, and what are the measures that it takes to drive those outcomes. And so what you can see on the screen here, and I won't read all of them, but I want to go through the outcomes measures that we're first and foremost trying to achieve, because as you're working with your teams and trying to cascade goals down through the organization, I think it's important that we all know what we're striving to get to. So most of these won't look new, but maybe a little bit nuanced or a little bit different from what how we've focused before. On the people pillar, focusing on employee retention. Now, that's not to say that employee engagement is not important. If you don't have good engagement, you're not going to have good retention. But ultimately, the outcome that we're trying to do is how do we keep our people in our organizations, in our units, in our hospitals and clinics. And so that is the ultimate goal that we're trying to get to. But obviously, to get to that, we have to look at engagement. We're looking at diversity. Our Diversity Inclusion Council, Stacy's a member, and several other members here I see on screen, which is great to see. Is important that we understand and make sure that our workforce is representative of the communities that we serve. Looking at turnover, looking at contract labor, things that we've looked at historically, we have to look at all of those different measures to ultimately get to that outcome of how do we keep our best people in our organization intact. So that's the outcome measure that we're focused on. And as you're working with your teams, we can cascade our goals down appropriately. From a service perspective, we've decided to standardize around Net Promoter Score. I know that this is something that we have done in the past, but not necessarily as the top measure. And the reason that we've moved in this direction away from HCAHPS, we still have to do HCAHPS for inpatient, but our organization is much bigger than an inpatient facility. We have clinics, we have imaging centers, we have outpatient urgent care centers. We have lots of different access points where patients engage that go beyond the regulatory body of what CMS requires of us. And so we will still, of course, meet our requirements, but we're going to be focusing on Net Promoter Score because that's something that we can look at across the entire company. And every individual business unit can have a Net Promoter Score, and we can all learn to get better. I was just on a call like this earlier this week with a bunch of CEOs from around the country, and I had the pleasure of meeting the CEO of United Airlines, and he was talking about his Net Promoter Score and what they've been doing to try to improve that, through a COVID world that we're all living in. And so Net Promoter Score is something that is universal and something that I think that we can focus on in terms of improving our our patient satisfaction across the organization. From a quality perspective, we've got two different measures. One is geometric mean length of stay. And while some of you might say that's a measure around financial or case management, it really does have implications to our quality across the patient care that we deliver. The longer somebody stays in the hospital that they don't need to be there, the more opportunity something could happen for them where they have a fall, have a hospital-acquired condition, or contract an infection. Something bad could happen, and so we want to make sure people are getting through the system carefully, effectively, and managing that responsibly. Most of our hospitals, but not all, are able to participate in the Leapfrog program, and so that's something else that we're very focused on. And the percentage of hospitals that are A or B. Proud to announce that 83% of our hospitals last year finished with an A or B score, a big improvement from where we were just a year prior. And that's something that we want to continue to build upon. From my understanding, we have the highest percentage of any large hospital chain, hospital company that has that percentage of Leapfrog scores where they're at. And we want to continue to build upon that reputation. I'd love to see all of our hospitals that are eligible 100% to be an A or B score. So that will be another goal. But obviously, there's lots of other things. Our focus around safety is not going away. Our serious safety event reporting, our focus around hospital-acquired infections and sepsis is still important. Employee safety, all of these things are important to be able to achieve those top goals and outcomes that we talk about. And so we measure lots of things. We will continue to measure lots of things, but in the quality pillar, those are going to be the overall top two things that we're focused on as a company. And then from a growth perspective, we're looking at lots of things. Again, we measure all types of things, but we're ultimately looking at our EBITDA and our free cash flow as those top two metrics. And so what can we all do to produce an environment to produce good scores around that? You have to be able to grow. You have to be able to accommodate more surgeries, accommodate more patients, get more clinic visits into the system. And so everything plays a role in terms of driving that. And we can cascade these down. But at the end of the day, what I wanted to walk away from was 6 very clear goals aligned around our pillars that we can focus and cascade around. And if we're doing the right things and following the right measures and pushing on the right processes to achieve those measures, we will achieve those goals and outcomes. And so just wanted to refresh the what behind what we're trying to achieve in 2021 and turn the balance of this conversation into the how. How do we get there from a leadership perspective? Jesse?
Thank you so much, Marty. Yeah, that's really going to help us set the stage, I think, for the rest of the conversation today. So when we think about all of the strategic priorities for our upcoming year, it's really important for us to start with the understanding that it's the leader's responsibility to and for others. So a leader needs to have ownership over their work, their team's work, and the success or the failures of both of those. So the responsibility to your team really starts with the idea that leading others starts with the leadership of self. You can't lead your team and execute successfully if you aren't able to lead yourself. As a leader, you also have a responsibility for others, and it's always a give and take situation. You need to give your team knowledge, respect, coaching, opportunity, and at the end of the day, it is your responsibility as a leader to help others grow. Now, you do also need to take. You need to take the blame. You need to take responsibility when things don't go as planned. You need to take away roadblocks, take feedback from your teams, and also take time to listen to them. It's your job to also be accountable for your team. Marty, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I love the title of this slide, Leadership's a Responsibility. And the word that comes out of this, and we'll talk more about this as we go through the presentation, is ownership. Leadership is not an easy thing. I'm not going to get into politics. We can see plenty of examples for pro and con about leaders taking ownership, but we have a responsibility to our patients. We have a responsibility to our teams, the people that we lead, and that they are trusting upon us. And being a leader is not always easy. It's not always the fun stuff in life. It's the challenging things that we have to deal with. And sometimes that means competing priorities, that we have to make tough decisions, and our ability to own those decisions as well as explain those decisions is important. And so I think it's just as Jesse said, taking care of yourself, because again, this is not easy stuff that we do. But also realizing that people are depending upon us, and we're going to talk about what do those best practices look like in terms of being able to be an owner and to be a leader and to take responsibility for those actions.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks so much for that. So today, as Marty mentioned, we are going to focus on ways that you can lead yourself, but also lead your team with that intention and that purpose to make sure we can execute on all those priorities and the what that Marty discussed with us earlier. So we're going to talk about all these on the list, but let's start with communication. So communication is really about clearly communicating and getting your ideas and information across to individuals and even groups in a way that engages both hearts and minds. It needs to also demonstrate emotional intelligence, and emotional intelligence is really a very widely researched topic, but it simply could be described as being aware that emotions can drive our behavior and they impact people, both positively and negatively. So it's also learning about how to manage those emotions, ours and the emotions of others. So Marty, I'd be interested to learn how you've seen communication really be an integral part of your day-to-day since you joined us just a few months ago.
Yeah, well, it's uber important. I'll just say that, and it's all the more challenging in the world we live in. And so we have to be creative in thinking about how do we reach out, and how do we communicate, how do we touch people, and meet them at their level. And some tips that I've learned and had to convince myself of is what my role is in terms of leading the organization is often to be the chief storyteller. And one of the ways that I like to involve in communication is analogies. One, I'm a big movie buff, and I usually have a movie quote or analogy for almost any situation that I can usually share. But a lot of times when you're trying to communicate a message or communicate something new or a concept or a hard message, I found it important to create an analogy. Take ourselves out of the emotion of whatever you're trying to create and describe a parallel of something that most people can relate to, and then tie it back to the issue at hand. And if you can do that, a lot of times, again, you're trying to make that connection is to make people comfortable and to realize that this is not necessarily unique to us. It may be new to us. It may be challenging, but lots of things happen and change, and we have to be ready to accommodate that, but helping people to understand that while something may be unique or novel or new or challenging to us, others have dealt with it, and there's successful outcomes, and here's the why behind the what. And so I think that's really important, is communicating that why and figuring out a way to connect to people in a way that they can understand that. So sometimes taking yourself out of the challenging message, creating a parallel, and then tying it back is one technique that I've used in the past to help with communication.
Yeah, I love that. I really love the idea of being the chief storyteller. I think we can all take a little note of that and do that in our day-to-day when we're communicating as well.
I always
so the second piece,
no,
sorry.
I was just going to side tangent. I always said when people ask you what did you want to do when you grow up, I wasn't sure, but I knew that sales and politics were not what I wanted to go into. And I think as leaders, a lot of times it can feel like most of our job becomes sales and politics, selling an idea, selling a change, selling what have you, and dealing with the politics of people that are for or against that. And so, while we may not do it in the classic sense as leaders, we all have that responsibility to help people. If we want to create followers, we have to create a message and communication to help them follow where we're going.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's great. So in addition to communication, it is also really important to manage conflict appropriately. Dealing effectively with others in a tough situation is really important, and I promise you conflict will inevitably happen at some point in work. So you have to make sure that you're using an appropriate style or a method that is very dependent on the situation that comes up. It's going to help reduce tension and manage that conflict between the group. So Marty, I'm interested in any best practices that you might have as it relates to managing conflict.
Yeah, as Jesse said, I mean, conflict is unavoidable. And if you don't have conflict in your life, we're probably not pushing hard enough in terms of what we're trying to achieve. So, but, people have heard me say this, that and I think we'll talk some about this in terms of change. People will follow change, but they need to understand the why behind the what, and you'll hear me say that again. But I've got two ground rules that when I came into the organization, and I've pretty much carried this with me throughout my career, that when I'm working with my team or you're working with your teams, my two ground rules are this. One, hats and titles come off when we're in the room. I'm not the CEO when we're in a room together. We're all on a team. We're all trying to achieve the same goal. We're trying to better the organization. We're trying to create a better environment for our patients. We're trying to create a better work environment for all of our fellow caregivers. We're all on the same team at the end of the day, but we might have different perspectives on how we get there. And so I don't like to have yes people around me. I like to be challenged. That's not always comfortable for me or for others to do so, but I think it's important if you want to get good teamwork to do that. So hats and titles come off as first. And the second is to be tough on the issue and not on the person. And what I mean by that is, if we're dealing with a challenging subject, and gosh knows we all had lots of challenge over the last year in particular, and we're still dealing with that. How do you make tough decisions? We have to be tough on the issue. And as much as possible, one, as a speaker, if I'm challenging somebody, not to make it personal to the person that I'm directing that at. And two, if I'm the person that is responsible for the issue we're talking about, to not overly personalize it. We can all get wrapped up in our world where we're so tunnel vision on what's in front of us that we forget there's a whole 360-degree view of people's opinions around the table. And if we can take ourself and our emotion and our egos out of the equation and just listen about what's the issue we're trying to communicate, that if I'm so focused, with my blinders on and what's in front of me, I might miss other people's perspectives. And so when I'm dealing with conflict, the goal is to try to, again, depersonalize it, de-emotionalize it, and be tough on the issue and go, okay, maybe there is a better way to do things than I was thinking about. And the only way I'm going to be able to learn that, to convince myself or to change my mind, is to get feedback from other people. And so hats and titles come off, and tough on the issue and not on the person are two of the ground rules that I've kept throughout my career that have served me well, and I think helped to build teams that are trusting and supportive and feeling able that they can challenge me or I can challenge them without people over personalizing the message that we're focused on.
That's great. Yes, I completely agree. And I think that those are two really great takeaways for our listeners today, as well as for me. So coaching is our next topic, and it is all about exploring and facilitating self-discovery. And yes, I said it's about facilitating self-discovery. So it's your job as a leader to build others' confidence so that they can accomplish a goal or solve a problem. And it's important that you also, as a leader, find opportunities to seek out coaching for yourself. How can you get better if you don't seek out that opportunity for you? So one thing to keep in mind when you're coaching your team is that you need to make sure to allow them the opportunity to identify ways that they can develop and grow. If you ask them for their ideas and input before you provide yours, it helps build ownership over their career and their role, more so than if you just offer up the solutions to your team. Marty, thoughts on coaching?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the best coaching happens when people don't realize they're being coached. And granted that's an art, and something that we could all improve upon. But if you take it in the classic sense, a coach versus a manager, the difference there is, somebody on the team, we've all watched a sporting event and yeah, some coaches get mad and they're throwing clipboards and yelling and screaming or whatever and passionate about it. That's probably not the healthiest idea of a coach in the context of what we do in life. But the encouragement, the motivation, you can do it. You can focus on it and helping people to solve problems. As I've gone through my career, rarely does somebody bring me an issue or a problem without having a suggestion. But sometimes they need the help, the encouragement to take that on, the permission to try something, even if it doesn't work. They might fail, but to realize that it's going to be a safe landing if that does happen. And encouraging people, helping them to do that. I had a mentor early in my life. Some of you from the Hillcrest division will remember the late Jim Harvey was one of my first mentors growing up, and he talked about this in a slightly different way, but he talked about managers versus leaders, and he says managers tell people do what to what, but leaders tell people do what to what and why. And I think that why component is so important. As a leader, but as a coach as well, in terms of helping to guide people to where we're trying to get to. If you're a conductor of an orchestra, if you're a leader of a football team, if you're leading your team, our ability to get things done is only as good as the people we're able to influence, motivate, and drive from a coaching perspective. And so think about that. How do you like to be coached? How do you respond and get the best out of you? It's usually not when somebody's throwing the clipboard at you or micromanaging you, slapping the ruler on the desk. It's really people that are encouraging you to bring out your best, and our people need the same thing. We're all wired the same way as humans, and most of us are going to respond to that positive encouragement and helpful advice versus the micromanaging side of what can inevitably happen in our world. So that's my thoughts.
Absolutely. Thank you. Our next area is around the topic of creating an inclusive environment. Now, this can be one of the most important components to remember, I think, when you're leading your teams. And it's really important, especially, that we're all working to create this inclusive environment. So some things to consider is that you need to make sure you're leveraging the abilities, perspectives, styles, and ideas of every single person on your team. That's what makes your team special and diverse and strong. Make sure that you are making your team members feel safe and encouraged and respected at all times. You need to also really understand what your biases are, because that's going to be really important to helping this process along. And you should always, always speak up if you ever see anyone being excluded or discriminated against in your team or even around your teams. So Marty, what recommendations do you have for our listeners today on how to really create that truly inclusive environment?
Yeah, I think to have a team and the best teams are, inclusive of everybody, but how do we do that from a practical standpoint? And I think one of the techniques that I've used is just to make sure that everybody's voice is heard. Are we inviting people to participate? And sometimes that's, we all know that, in any team, you've got your extroverts, your introverts, and people in the middle. And some people are going to try to dominate a conversation no matter what the topic is. And some people will never speak if you allow them not to. And I think in creating an inclusive team, part of the leadership challenge is to make sure that we are hearing everybody's voice. Because sometimes the person that's quiet, it's not that they don't have something to say, it's they need to feel welcome. They need to feel included in the conversation and make that happen, and to encourage that voice, because if you don't do that, sometimes important things get left out. And somebody might quietly be sitting and thinking to themselves, because they're not going to say it after the fact either, because they're quiet, as well, I could have told you that, but we didn't. And so for us to get the best outcomes as we're leading our teams, we have to include people in those decisions, and make sure that we're seeking and soliciting that advice. There's a couple of other things as we talk about inclusion. Obviously, we've got our Diversity Inclusion Council. We have to make sure that we're including representative people across the board as well, and make sure that those voices are heard through every demographic. And I was just reading something the other day that caught my eye, and it talked about social diversity. And so we're more aware now than we have been about whether it's race or gender or sexual identity and those types of things, but social inclusion was one. And so, we're all managing a variety of workforce from baby boomers to Gen Z. I think that's the latest. I'm not sure which one, and everybody in between, and making sure that we're socially diverse in the decisions that we're making, and inclusive of all social orientations as well. So I thought that was an interesting read recently, but it just goes to speak that, again, the best teams are going to be the teams that include everybody's input, include information and input from everybody. And that's something that we need to be mindful of as we're going forward, and just making sure that we are actively soliciting that information and not waiting for people to speak up on their own.
Absolutely. That's great. And it's a really good segue actually into our next topic, which is about engaging and retaining talent. So this is really important, and it's all about recognizing what is the most important to each particular person's job satisfaction, and then you taking the action to provide it. So as we just talked about, it's really no surprise that everyone is different. Some people will speak up in the meeting and some people won't. But since that's the case, it's also no surprise that it's important to understand how each team member would like to be recognized. So would they prefer a shout out at a team huddle, or would they rather a handwritten note? Would they like some extra time to spend on a project they're really passionate about? The end result is you need to get to know your team to understand their individual preferences. And then you also need to talk about your why. You should talk about yours. You should spend time discussing connect purpose stories. You should share Ardent's mission and vision, and how each person connects to Ardent's success. If team members see how their work impacts the success of our organization, they're so much more likely to be engaged and connected. So you need to commit to building an engaged environment. And work is tough sometimes, and right now it's pretty much tough all the time for some. But you do need to take some time to celebrate even small wins. And if you need support during this time, you should ask for help too, because remember, we started with leadership starts with a responsibility to your teams, and that means taking care of you too. So Marty, do you have any best practices here regarding engaging and retaining talent that have helped you keep your teams engaged, especially when it's a very difficult time?
Yeah, two things come to mind here, Jesse. One is, if it involves them, involve them. And we're going to, I think, talk some more about that as well. But we as leaders have responsibility that we have to take action on, to lead through. And sometimes those decisions are not popular; they're not the things that you want, but they're the best for the company, and we have to lead those things and power through. But the best thing is to involve people as much as practical and possible through any tough situation that we're dealing with. And so that's one. The second is I was a pre-med psychology major, and while I didn't end up going in directly into that, my trainings helped me well for what we do here. And that is to try to get to know your people. And one of the things that I've done with teams throughout my career is to try to engage people through different personality tests, and to understand that people really are wired differently. Jesse and I were talking about this the other day in terms of how we prepare for something like this, and there's those of us that like to write everything out, and there's those of us that get flustered by that, and so we all have different intrinsic qualities about us, and we know ourselves better than anybody else. But when we're working as a team, we're not working as individuals, and for me to know and understand how other people are wired, and what drives them, what motivates them, what refreshes them versus what deflates them is important. And so if anybody's ever taking the Myers-Briggs or the Enneagram or those types of things, those are tools that I've found very helpful when you're working with your close team to understand how are people wired and how does that work. If you've heard of those things, I'm an INTJ. So I'm much more introverted by nature than extroverted, but there's times when I have to play a role where it causes me to do that. And I've adapted that, but my nature is to be introverted. So if I'm quiet around somebody, it's not because, I'm not upset with somebody or what have you. It's just that's kind of how I am and who I am. And so the more your team understands how you're wired, the more effective I think you can be with your teams. And just understand what drives them, what motivates them. And so those things, and if it involves them, involve them. And by any means possible. And some of that's conversation. You don't have to do formal testing, but just understand what drives people. We know that there's people that are visual learners. There's people that are auditory learners. I'm a visual person, and so I need to see the visuals, and I can hear something and it goes in one ear and out the other. And so we all know that we're different, but we have to respect our teams are different too. And so if we're communicating one way and we think we're getting the point across, we might be missing the point to half of our team. And so we have to really get to know them, and if we want to get the best from them, understand who they are as a person, how they need to be cared and nurtured, so that they can provide their best. I think we all want to provide our best in what we do, but until we know each other and how that happens, it's much more difficult to get there.
Absolutely. I completely agree. Thank you for that. So delegating is our next topic, and it is actually the task of looking for and following through on opportunities that can help you achieve your results by also building the capability of others when you assign tasks or even decision-making responsibilities. So it also includes some components that you may not necessarily think about, but are really important. That means you should set some clear boundaries for whatever tasks or decision-making responsibilities you're setting out to delegate. You need to set those boundaries, offer support, and make sure that you're following up. Effective leaders delegate to develop people while they're still accomplishing their team's goals, so it's kind of a win-win. But when we set goals, one of the most important things to remember is that you should plan how you're going to measure the goal. So Peter Drucker has a quote. It states, "You can't manage what you can't measure." And what he really just means is that you can't know whether or not someone is truly successful unless you're defining what success looks like and then figuring out how you're going to measure it. So Marty, what are your thoughts on delegation and setting goals and objectives?
Yeah, so from a management perspective, I've got a theory, and then I've got an example that comes to mind with this. But from a management perspective, the way I've always tried to deal with delegation is to follow something, and I wish I could remember who I first heard this from, but it kind of describes how I think to do things. It's tight, loose, tight. And so let's tightly define the objective that we're trying to achieve. Loosely give people the opportunity within the boundaries of moral, ethics, regulatory environment that we live in, go solve the problem, and then tightly come back and say, did we get to the outcome we were looking for? If so, great, celebrate it. If not, why not? What can we do differently? And but give people the latitude to get to the outcome. And we all know that if we were given a task to do and we can do it solely by ourselves, there's an idea in my mind of how I would get there. But if I'm going to get the best from our organization, from our team, I've got to trust that there's other good ideas, and I have to decide, is the outcome where I'm trying to get to or my process? And so I've said, if I wanted to get this bottle across the room, I can pick it up and move it over there. But the goal is it me picking it up and moving it over there, or is it getting across the room? You can go under the table, you can go over the table, you can go around the table, you can go through the table. There's different energy levels that might be involved, but if the outcome is the goal, then we have to respect that there's a lot of different ways of getting there, and there might have been a more efficient and more direct way to do it, but as we're working with teams, help them to realize that they have some latitude, and maybe the efficient way in your mind doesn't work as well as taking the long route, so long as we get there, because there might be other things that are important along the way. And so I think that's part of one, empowering your team, but two, encouraging them. So tight, loose, tight is one of those things. And the practical analogy that comes to mind thinking about this is, and this goes back a number of years, I was rounding through one of the hospitals that I was at, and it was a neuro ICU unit, and I was talking to the charge nurse, and his name's Mike, and he said, I was asking how things were going, and he's like, honestly, not very well. I'm like, okay, tell me more. And he's like, we're always short-staffed. We never have enough people. The acuity is high. We're working our tails off, and something that I'm sure some of you on the phone have heard this story or could relate to. And I said, okay, well, let's unpack this when you're not in the middle of taking care of patients. And so, we agreed, and he came and he met with me the next morning, and I said, okay, what's the issue? He's like, we're always short-staffed, and he's like, I don't understand why, executives here want us to be short-staffed. And I said, I don't, sure, you can say that and it sounds good, but it's like, we all have productivity standards. And he was saying this productivity standard is why we can't hit our goal. Or why we're so short-staffed. And it's like, okay, well, let's break this down. And I said, how many nurses do you think it would take to adequately staff the unit? And, the way that you feel it should be done. And so he says, okay, well, we need to have 2 nurses for every patient in a neuro ICU. And I said, I would agree with that. And so I walked him through, how do we build a productivity standard? So 2 nurses, for every patient. You got an average census of 20, divided that, by the number of hours in the day. And this is how many people you would need to have. He's like, I said, would that be good staffing? He's like, that'd be great staffing. I said, okay, well, what else do you need? He's like, well, that's the most of it. I said, well, you've got a manager. You need to add those hours in there. Do you have aides? Yeah, we have that. Okay, we add those hours in there. And we added all these things up, and I showed him, how do we build these productivity standards at the end of the day? And when we added it all up, what he thought was good staffing was less hours than what the actual staffing goal was. So I said, my goal is for you to hit this staffing target, and what you gave me, which would be your perfect world staffing, is actually less hours than that. So it's not that I don't want you to have it, it's just that we're not getting it. So now let's peel the onion back and let's go to what's driving that. And so, what it turned out to be was a scheduling issue. And the manager was scheduling and had a bunch of holes in the schedule. So we knew that we needed 6 nurses per shift, and they were putting out a schedule that routinely had holes where there was only 5 people on there. And then if there's, a call in, which those things happen, we all know that, then you've got 4 nurses. And so we ended up being, a third short, on routinely, and it was very frustrating. And so you can imagine where their engagement scores were. So as we unpack this, I'm like, well, how do the charge nurses get involved in scheduling? It's like, well, we're not allowed to do that. So I talked to the manager. I said, look, you've got an issue here. And she acknowledged that. And I said, your charge nurses want to help you with this. Now, I can't see everybody's hands, but I'm sure if I were to ask you, who would love to give up their scheduling, the hands would go up, right? And so let's involve our people in making the decision, so long as we set the structure and say, here's the rules, here's what we've got to do. And, and then come back and measure, did we do it right? Things may be different than how you would do it, but what's the outcome? What's the goal? It's to get to the staffing that we wanted. And so they took it over, and that charge nurse came back and thanked me for the conversation. I said, thank you for bringing it to my attention. We got to a workable solution, and that charge nurse went on to be a manager and then a director at that hospital. But by listening, empowering, and giving people ownership in things that involve them, turned a bad situation into a positive situation. And a lot of it was just misunderstanding. And so it goes back to that communication point in terms of what we're trying to do, and do people understand the intention behind what we're trying to get at? Do they understand when we have targets, where do they come from? It's the why part of it, and helping people to get to, this isn't just some random number that somebody picked out of the air. There's thoughtfulness that went behind it, and we can get there. But if there's a problem with that, let's peel back the onion and figure that out. So it involves a lot of the different concepts we talked about, but I thought it was an analogy that really is germane to what we all face as leaders on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, that's a great example, and a great example too of finding an opportunity to provide development for some where the leader in that group really was not enjoying creating the schedule, and it was something that was, once you had the guardrails, it was easy to pass down and say, this is a task that could help develop you, but we had the boundaries, we could help support, we followed up, and that's what makes it a successful opportunity to delegate. That's great. Thank you. So our next topic and one of the final pieces we'll talk about today is building and sustaining trust. And this is one of the most imperative things that we'll talk about today, because building trust and building those trusting relationships really helps to enable people to take those risks, to figure out what the problem is and then solve it. And also it helps them to collaborate to achieve those results. It's one of the main responsibilities of a leader. And to do this, to build that trust and then keep it, to sustain it, you really need to listen to understand. It's not enough to just listen. You need to listen to hear the problem. And Marty, I think your example was spot on there. You know, you need to also keep your commitments. If you say you're going to do something, you need to follow through with it. So one, you have to be, careful with the communication that you do share, but also if you do make a commitment, you need to follow through. You need to also seek and value unique opinions, even getting back to the creating an inclusive environment. Seeking out and valuing those opinions is really going to help you get really, really far along, but also build that trust with your team. You do need to let your team members also lead. So that's an important part. You are the leader, but you also need to allow them the opportunity to lead as well. And finally, you have to let people learn from their mistakes. That's where all the learning happens anyway. So if you're setting the boundaries and you're following up, then if mistakes happen, learning from them is where all the magic is going to happen. So Marty, tell me a little bit about trust. What do you want our leaders to take away from this particular topic?
Yeah, there's a few words that come to mind, but transparency, integrity, and ownership. I think that's, as a leader and as you're trying to do that, you have to embody those principles. And there's a song I think it's by the Fray that comes to mind, and I don't know the name of the song, but the lyrics go, sometimes the right thing and the hard thing are the same. And there's lots of things as leaders that we have to be responsible for. We have to have ownership for, and it may not be an easy message to deliver. And the easy thing would be to pass the buck. Well, somebody's making me do this. Something else is happening. But the reality is, there's a reason why we have to do the things that we do. And, it may not be easy to communicate, but it's the right thing for people to understand the why behind the what. And so you can see a lot of these best practices that Jesse's been talking about come down to a few similar themes that you can repeat over, but helping people to understand the why, being transparent, involving people, leading with integrity, and just that purpose of what we're here for, and then the ownership for whatever the issue is that we have to own. And believe me, there's tough issues, tough challenges that we all have to do. And communicating those is not always easy. It's not always fun, but we have to remember what we're all here for at the end of the day as leaders, and that's to provide the best environment for our patients and for our teams to be able to provide our mission. And it's not always about what do we want, what do we hope for. It's about doing what's best for our patients and for our organization, and that's the burden of leadership that we all have to contend with. And so just leading with trust, with transparency, with integrity and respect, and owning those issues regardless of how we might personally feel about them.
Absolutely. That's perfect. And you actually mentioned a few of the things that we're going to talk about next, and that's really just to help wrap up the session, spending a couple minutes just talking about owning that improvement, owning that change. If we want to improve, then we have to change, and it's our role as leaders to help manage that change. And the quote on the screen, people don't resist change, they resist being changed. I think, Marty, you've mentioned that previously, but it's so accurate. I mean, if a job is going to if a change is going to involve and affect an employee, then it's our job to involve that employee in the change. Now, I understand employees can't be involved in every single decision, but it's important that we remember that if we want to get better, that we're going to have to improve and get better. We're going to have to involve our staff and in how that improvement and that change actually does happen. Marty, any final thoughts on this ownership topic?
Yeah, I think we've hit these topics pretty well, but Peter's quote is a good one, and the way I've paraphrased that over the years is people aren't as resistant to change as we think they are. It's change done with you versus change done to you, and sometimes change is done to us, and we have to respond to that and own that when it happens. But a lot of times people have opportunities to be involved in that change, and it goes back to understanding the why behind the what. And so the more that we can involve people in the decisions, the more that they will hopefully understand them, accept them, and go along with them. But there are some times when change happens to us, and that's something that we have to deal with as well. COVID happened to us. We didn't ask for that. The Joint Commission changes rules, and that happens to us. We don't always get a say in that, or CMS changes how we're reimbursed for something. We can have input, but ultimately we don't have control. But within the things that we have control of is in our day-to-day running the operations, how we conduct ourselves. We have a lot of latitude to involve people in those decisions and make them part of the decision as much as possible. And when the things happen to us that we can't control, then to own those issues and to help people see the why behind the what and what's ultimately going to be the benefit for that in terms of driving that to better our patients and to better the people that are taking care of our patients at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for all of the tips and the tricks and all of the stories. I think it's really been helpful for me to kind of connect some dots and take it and put it into practice. We've talked about a lot of stuff. There's a lot of things to consider. And before we share an idea about how to take this and actually go put it into action, I'm actually very interested, and I think Marty might be too, to hear what area you guys think you might have the most opportunity out of the stuff we've talked about today to develop in. So if you're not a leader, we would love to hear what you think you might be able to work on to help influence change in your department. So go ahead and get out your phone and open up an internet browser tab and navigate to www.menti.com. The code you'll enter is 7703639. And I'll put this up on the screen for you. So again, menti, menti.com, 7703639. And let us know which of these components you think you have the most opportunity to develop in. It could be one, it could be more than one. And again, if you're not a leader, we're interested to hear what you might be able to help develop on to influence that change. Okay, so far we're seeing maybe some communication could be a good opportunity. Delegating can pop up pretty frequently. Managing conflict is another area that people seem to think that they could use some work in. It looks like creating an inclusive environment is staying on the low side, which is good because that means that people think that they're pretty good there. Always opportunities to improve, but that's nice to see. It looks like managing conflict is kind of coming in for the win here. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time. And I will tell you that we will be providing you with a self-assessment. So this is going to help you kind of take this and put it into action. As a follow-up to the session today, you'll receive the self-assessment. You'll complete it. There's going to be statements that you'll rate your proficiency of each of the leadership skills on a scale of 1 to 5. The self-assessment will actually score for you and give you a nice average of each section. And those with the lowest average and those with the highest will end up being your strengths and your development needs. You can then kind of look over those and think about which skills are going to carry kind of the most importance in the role that you're sitting in today. And the last step, although it's not required, I do strongly recommend it. If you take those results and then have a conversation with your leader about them, maybe set a professional development goal related to the most important skills that you found with the lowest average rating. I think it'll be really helpful for you to be able to take an honest look at yourself and then go put some work into it. So at this time, I do think we have just a little bit of time for a couple questions. So Marty, if you're up for it, let me see what we've gotten in the chat here.
Well, and while you're checking that, since managing conflict was one of the higher scores, I'll just add another tidbit in there. Sometimes when you know that there's going to be a situation that's going to be controversial, is just to call it out. With your team, and just acknowledging that helps to dissipate some of the emotion. I know this is going to be a tough issue. I want to solicit people's feedback, and I want us to be objective without personalizing. And so if we can just sometimes help call those things out and acknowledge that this is not a fun topic, or it's not a topic that we're necessarily all going to be aligned, but how do we make the best decision and move forward? Sometimes just clearing the air and acknowledging that helps take some of the tension out. And if somebody does see things getting personal, I think that's where, as leaders, we also have to pause and do that. If there's an issue, and pick on Jesse here, and people are like, well, Jesse's always, no. We're tough on the issue. We're not tough on Jesse. And that's going to, help Jesse feel validated that this is not a personal issue, but it's also going to help others to realize, okay, Jesse may be responsible for this topic. Let's say we're talking about a supply issue or something. Our supply chain director, doesn't have enough gloves. Well, does that person not want to have enough gloves, or is there a circumstance that's causing that and they're bringing something here? I think this is a real issue that we've had to deal with here with the pandemic. And so let's take the person out of it and go, okay, all right, the reality is there's not enough gloves being produced right now for this. And, we can not like it all we want, but what do we want to do with it? And it's not Jesse's fault that we don't have them. It's a global supply chain issue. So what are we going to do about it? How do we communicate that to our people and do that? So call it out, acknowledge it, take the people out of it. And, that I think that really helps everybody in the long run.
That's great. That's really helpful. I did get a couple questions in the chat relative to resources that could be kind of supplementary to this, and I did want to just put it out there that Marty actually recommended some great articles, and we have some additional resources that we'll be sharing after the session. They'll likely go out with the recording of this presentation as well, so you'll get some of those resources. And then we also did receive, what kind of training does Ardent offer to help us develop on these leadership skills? So Marty, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
And say it again, just training, you said?
Yeah, what kind of training does Ardent help us to develop these leadership skills? So I'm thinking like the DDI Frontline Leader Program.
Yeah, we've got a number of things. I think one is Women at Ardent, to the diversity training that we've got, but through organizational development, this is as important for me to hear is what else do we need to focus on? And so, through our normal training modules that we have, and Jim Hughes and organizational development, and Jesse's role, we are trying to constantly find relevant, timely information that will be helpful to everybody's personal growth and development. And those are just a couple of the areas that we're doing that.
Perfect. Wonderful. I love this question, and I think this will probably just be our last question. We did get a lot, so if you didn't get your question answered, we'll try to do a follow-up with Marty and get some answers out to everyone in the follow-up to the session as well. But Marty, this one's great, and I'm interested to hear it too. So there's been a lot of talk about measuring success and progress. So how do you personally measure successful leadership?
Well, I'm a big believer in measurement, and so there's always the outcomes, hence the beginning of the conversation. And you can have a great personality or a wonderful personality, but what are the outcomes? Now, I will say that I'm not a fan of people that get outcomes by doing things that are not healthy, characteristics to role model. But it's about being a balanced leader, about driving results, but how you do that, and the personal side is important as the outcome side. So I look for progress. People that are willing to try, and we're making progress. Not to say that everybody's going to be perfect, not to say that there's going to be mistakes. People that are willing to try something versus always play it safe. And so I think if we know the outcomes that we're trying to get to, and analogy with the water bottle getting across, we're driving towards the goals, we're making progress towards the goals. Those are the things that stand out to me as people that are willing to try, that can back up the reasons behind what they're doing. They're not being reckless or willy-nilly about things. That we're always focusing on making that forward progress are some signs of successful leadership. I was just looking at the chat comments as well, and I saw the other one that popped out here. Just if we have a second, what if you find being tough on an issue makes people reactive rather than open to it? Great question, and I think that's probably more likely to happen than not. But I think it goes back to the theme of inclusiveness, and hearing people's different perspectives. Now, the goal is, when I say hats and titles come off and we're going to be tough on the issue, I expect, and if I'm not getting it, I'll go around the table and I'm just looking at names and the faces. And so Jesse has talked, and Amanda has talked, and Ann's talked, but Carrie's not said anything. And so I'm going to go, Carrie, what are you thinking about this? And those are the things that are important. And Carrie may have a completely different view. This happened to me just a week ago in a meeting, and several people on my team were speaking up, but somebody didn't. And I asked, and I got an opinion. And one, it wasn't what I was expecting to hear. And two, it really changed the whole conversation, And so, I think that if you're going to be tough on the issue, you have to be open to people being reactive. But ultimately, the goal is to make a better decision, because we're all trying to move the organization or move the issue in a positive direction. And unless people feel heard and have the opportunity to put that out there, you're not going to get the best solution in the end. And so I think you have to expect it. You have to be ready for it. But at the end of it, everybody has to come together and say, so what are we going to do? And then we have to own that, regardless of my opinion. If we say we're going to go left, and there's a couple of people that said right, when we walk out of the room, we all have to own that we're going to go left on this, and we're going to make the best of that. So another great question as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of great ones. I wish we had a lot more time, but like I said, we will definitely follow up on some of those unanswered questions. I did want to let you know two more things as we wrap up today. One, I just popped up a QR code for a brief post-session feedback survey. If you get out your phone and you open your camera, you should actually just be able to point your camera to that QR code, and you will be launched straight into the survey from your phone. The survey link should also be posted in the chat in the WebEx as well. We would greatly appreciate your feedback on this session and any feedback you have on future sessions as well. So if you can just take a minute or two and fill that out, we'd greatly appreciate it. And then finally, I'm really excited to announce this. Our upcoming February session speaker will be Marty Bonick, and she is a fantastic Franklin Covey leadership consultant and coach. And she's not only a skilled leadership coach, but she's been with Franklin Covey for over 12 years. And my favorite thing is that her personal mission is encouraging and empowering people to actualize their greatest potential. If that doesn't excite you, that's crazy. So I'm really excited. I think it's going to be a great session. Before she worked at Franklin Covey, she also worked for a major health system in Atlanta, and she was a manager of employee retention. So she should have a lot of great things to share. Now, we're still finalizing some of the details around the session, but be on the lookout for more, and I'm sure you won't want to miss it. So I want to thank you guys for your time today. And Marty, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and expertise and ideas with us. I think everyone really appreciated it.
Thank you. It's great to see everybody. I hope you all have a great weekend. It was wonderful to be here with you today. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks so much, guys. Bye-bye.